Welcome to a special series of Beyond the Text, the interviews. I'm your host, Samuel Woodall, and in this podcast series, we'll embark on a captivating exploration of ideas in intellectual history and political thought, through in-depth conversations with former colleagues, esteemed academics, and influential public figures. Whether you're an academic, a history enthusiast, or simply curious about the world of ideas, each episode provides a unique opportunity to engage with brilliant minds who have left an indelible mark on our intellectual landscape. Join me as we journey through intellectual history and political thought, guided by the insights of my guests. Welcome to our first episode of Beyond the Text, the interviews. I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Dominic Aquila, a tenured professor of history at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. With 30 years' experience in higher education, Dr. Aquila is not only a seasoned educator, but also a trustee and chair of the Council of Scholars of the American Academy of Liberal Education. His expertise extends to areas such as history, opera, culture, and higher education. And Dr. Aquila holds a doctorate of education in higher education administration from Texas Tech University and a doctor of literature and philosophy and history from the University of South Africa. Additionally, he has an MBA from New York University and a Bachelor of Music from the Juilliard School. Having served in key leadership roles, including founding Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas, Dr. Aquila brings a wealth of knowledge and insight to our discussion today. Join us as we explore his journey, delving into his thoughts on history, culture. Welcome, Dr. Dominic Aquila, to Beyond the Text, the interview.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And yes, we're going to be looking at your work, The Church in the Age of Enlightenment from 1648 to 1848. So I suppose I'll start with an introduction. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background as a historian?
Well, the introduction you read it catches most of what's important in my life. I started out. I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, and then I did my high school education in Brooklyn in Catholic schools, and then went on to the Juilliard School. After that, I went into arts administration. I took the MBA from NYU. And I worked in the field of the orchestra, the American Symphony Orchestra in New York, the Rochester Philharmonic in upstate New York. And then I moved over to managing dance companies. And then I met a wonderful man who was taken from us too early. In fact, this is the 30th anniversary of his death, Christopher Lash. And Lash drew me back into graduate school, where I started my doctorate at history at the University of Rochester, and then completed it at South Africa. Then from then on, my whole career has been in higher education, both in teaching and in administration of higher ed. So my interest has always been, I never wanted to lose any of anything in my career. So I've always tried to, for example, when I do history, I try to understand history, not just political history, but how political history interrelates with cultural history. Right. And because my background is especially focused on music, I always like to see the interplay between music and culture. So that's been a principal focus. But I also very interested in theological questions. Basically, I never took a degree in theology, but I read deeply in theology. A lot of my colleagues, one of the things that when you complete a doctoral degree, your education only starts. And I had so much to learn from esteemed colleagues wherever I taught. So that's pretty much what I really wanted to do, is keep all of my background together, and then when I do my writing and my teaching, is to keep a sense of the integration of everything. One of my favorite ideas recently is the kind of retrieval of the idea of a polymath,
Yes, but yeah, I was just about to say you are the exemplar polymath then in terms of.
I don't want to flatter myself to think that I'm a one, but there's a great European historian, Peter Burke,
Yes, yeah.
who recently, I think it's within the last 5 years or so, wrote a book called The Polymath. And he goes through, because he's a very good historian, how the polymath is someone whose reputation has suffered over the past, in part because of the Enlightenment, that usually there's so much knowledge to get hold of at our time. People have become specialized and even hyper specialized.
And disciplinization that happens in the Enlightenment into those specific.
So anyone who tries to speak out of his or her field is looked at with suspicion. And it's true. I mean, you could move across disciplines and be a kind of dilettante, and not deep knowledge. So Burke's book is really good because, I mean, he punctures that myth, and he opens the book by a very beautiful sentence: "Polymaths have suffered greatly over time." But the nice thing at the end of his book, he has a list. I think it's 500 polymaths from the 1500 to the present.
Oh wow.
So anyway, I mean, again, I don't want to flatter myself to think I stand with the great polymaths of history, but it's at least the idea of that which has always been very seductive for me.
I think that's why I fell in love with what we call, like intellectual history. I know in the US they call it sort of the history of ideas, but sort of studying history in such a way that you can incorporate everything, from music all the way through to theatre and art, but everything having an influence on thought and political thought, but social thought. And I think that's why I've taken up the reins of sort of being an intellectual historian, because it can incorporate all those things you've listed, including music, which is also a passion of mine as a violinist as well. So I've always so on that point, what inspired you to delve into the history of the Catholic Church intertwined with the Age of Enlightenment?
The origin of the book came from a discussion I had with a friend of mine who's a very productive writer. His name is Mike Aquilina. He's the general editor of the whole series that I'm a part of. And he asked if I might be interested in doing the Enlightenment, because he knows I've always had an interest in that period. So that's when I took on the project. He commissioned me to write this book, and it is part of a much larger series. But I might focus on the Enlightenment again with this interest of what is a polymath, and the Enlightenment. In one part of the book, I call the Enlightenment the empire of division, because it separates things so in these hermetically sealed categories. So the big one, of course, is the separation of faith. Faith is a way of knowing, right? And reason. It separates mind from the full embodiment of what it means to be a human person, right? And then from there, the disciplines become sort of hermetically sealed off from one another. So I wanted to find out, how did this happen? What was going on that resulted, the grand synthesis, at least in the Western tradition, of the unity of faith and reason, the unity of all knowledge, is seen a kind of circle of knowledge. When was it that tradition? When did it become, when did it become obsolete? Or and it never becomes obsolete. There are still people working in that. It's just that the Enlightenment brought into was the beginning of this kind of high specialization. So that was my interest.
Oh no, that's really interesting. And I mean, that sort of goes into talking about an overview of your book, because that is obviously what you're pursuing. But could you provide a sort of brief overview of your sort of where you went with the church in the Age of Enlightenment, in terms of the direction?
So as you well know, may I call you Sam, by the way?
Yeah,
Sam?
of course you can. Yes, just Sam. Yeah, and there it is for anyone who's
there's the book. So one of the things when you become a historian today and you study like the history of ideas at university, one of the things you quickly realize is that professionalized history is really a product of the 19th century, and it's predominantly a function of Protestant views of things. So there is the tendency, because history itself as a discipline is in some ways an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. In some cases, it's part of Romanticism as well. But the professional historians tended to obscure the role of religion but particularly the Catholic Church in religion. And the battle cry of the Enlightenment, like Voltaire, is that the Catholic Church is the enemy. It's that which has prevented human knowledge and human freedom from progressing. And so that's a very skewed view. And so I wanted to go back and sort of uncover the Catholic. Now, I wanted to do it in a way, there's so much history today. If I think of American history, for example, you say, okay, what group is left out of history? Okay, so perhaps women were left out. Okay, so you want to introduce them into the narrative. When this idea of including voices in history who had heretofore not been heard, they came in a kind of very episodic way. They came in, if you can envision one of these terrible American history books, where they have the main line and then off to the side they have these little vignettes.
Sort of shoehorned in, as we sometimes
say.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, there was,
Yeah.
this woman who did thus and such.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to write a book like that. I didn't want to write a book that said, oh, by the way, the Catholics did this too. I wanted to weave it in so that it became part of a narrative that had, before now been one-sided, and not just a kind of Protestant influence, but rather those who celebrate reason above all else, and science and technology have tended to underplay the role of the church. So I didn't want it to be a side piece. I wanted it to be integral to the narrative.
And I suppose, again, this sort of leads on to what I was going to say next. But so what would you say motivated you to choose the Enlightenment? I suppose you're sort of saying, the Protestant writing of history through to that kind of scientization and reason, but why not? Why did you choose that? Rather, for example, I've just written, when I was doing my master's, I wrote my dissertation on reassessing Cardinal Bellarmine and his contribution to political thought. Right. Why did you choose the Enlightenment in particular?
Okay, so a very practical reason. When my friend contacted me, he said, "Can you do the Enlightenment?"
Yes.
So it was a very kind of very practical reason, and it was not something that I had to do make a lot of gyrations in order to do it. But you're right. I mean, I think, and many times in the book itself that I wrote, I found myself, I looked at the Enlightenment as a reform movement, all right? And, there's a series of reform movements throughout Western Europe, Western civilization. In fact, that's one of its great features, right? Is this ability to correct itself when things go askew. So I could have begun as early as the Renaissance in Great Britain and Ireland back in the 600s, and so in the book I sort of cheated a little bit because I said, the Enlightenment is a reform movement in a history of reform movements, right? So I was able to smuggle in a little bit of what went on in other reform movements, like the Ottonian Renaissance, the Carolingian Renaissance, the Renaissance of the 12th century, the Italian Renaissance, because I see Renaissance as a reform movement. But I think the clincher in this respect about the Enlightenment as one among in a history of reform movements is one of the great historians of the 20th century, Christopher Dawson. Dawson was he had people don't write history like this anymore. It's forbidden, but a kind of grand sweep of the narrative of history. And he had this line in one of his histories, is that the Enlightenment was the last great heresy in the history of the church.
Mm.
Why? Why is that the case? And so that was another kind of provocation for me to figure,
Interesting.
why would somebody say that? And I got the idea of the Western civilization having this series of renaissances from Dawson. He explores that too. He takes it from the point of view of okay, everybody thinks the Renaissance only refers to the Renaissance in Italy in the 1400s. So no, no, no. You can go back all the way to the Renaissance of the 6th century and so on and so on. So that intrigued me to see the Enlightenment as a reform movement that was from the vantage point of the Catholic Church, and it was heretical. And I have a little section in the book, kind of fun section, was taking on Dawson. Was it heretical? The church never came out and said the Enlightenment is heretical. That's the opinion of Christopher Dawson, but it's an interesting idea to play with because it did kind of distort and undo this great kind of synthesis that we had in the great tradition of the classical, the Hebrew and the Christian tradition.
Yeah, and question those old authorities like through, particularly with figures like Voltaire, questioning those old traditions and authorities. One thing that you do, which is great when it comes to trying to debate the time frame of Enlightenment, is the fact that you've already clearly bracketed a time frame for the Enlightenment is sometimes useful for me when I'm talking to fellow students about when the Enlightenment was. I was just writing the first chapter of my PhD thesis last term, and so often you go into a book on the Enlightenment and the author doesn't want to put any bookends to where the Enlightenment starts and finishes. So actually your book was quite good to just get a grasp of where the Enlightenment lay, I think for someone coming at the Enlightenment for the first time perhaps as well. But yeah, turning to the significance of the Catholic Church, in your book you mentioned that Catholics made significant contributions to science, arts, and the betterment of human life during the Enlightenment. Could you elaborate on some of the key contributions highlighted in your book?
Yeah, for me, especially, going back over the book, the key figure for me is Pascal, Blaise Pascal, because he was, his Enlightenment credentials could never be disputed. He was a great mathematician. Some of your listeners may remember, you may be too young for this, Sam, but one of the first computer programs was called O Pascal, because in reference to the fact that Pascal was one of the first innovators in making a computer. So because he was in the thick of French society, and so he saw what was, first of all, he saw the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which to me, and that's one of the great things I learned in this book, was how the 30 Years' War, which was from 1618 to 1648, how that really set the social political conditions for ideas that would become center stage for the Enlightenment, how they could then find fertile ground. But Pascal had lived during the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which was devastating for Europe. But he had a very personal encounter with it. His father was a fairly well-off middle-class man in France. He was an accountant and there's a story about that if we have time I can go into. But when Cardinal Richelieu needed to fund the French support for the Protestant side of the 30 Years' War, he decided not to pay, the government would not pay the debts on bonds that Pascal's father and others were holding. But Pascal's father became destitute because of that, and he never really recovered. So Pascal realized, indirectly, but personally, an effect of the 30 Years' War. But Pascal always also was very well aware of René Descartes. And Rene Descartes is always held out as one of the central figures of the Enlightenment because of the way he went about searching for truth. Of course, Descartes, this kind of fanatical quest for certainty. And that became, I think, I saw this in a number of places in the Enlightenment, is a mantra. What can we know and know with certainty? We don't want any vague knowledge. We don't want, talks about, a realm of the transcendent that we can't nail down. But Pascal corrected Descartes. Descartes' overemphasis on beginning with doubt, and also Descartes, I sort of set the stage for Immanuel Kant's radical separation of mind from the body. Kant says, it's all about the mind, right? And Pascal sort of corrects that. He introduces the idea of heart. Now, again, from our vantage point, we're still all children of the Enlightenment. When you hear, Pascal say something like heart, well, you could say, oh, yeah, he's just prefiguring the romantic reaction to the cult of reason and the Enlightenment. No. I mean, the idea of what's for Pascal as heart is much more like the ancient Hebrew understanding of what it means, the core of what it means to be human. It's the unity of everything we're about. So that, I think Pascal was, other people made contributions. The Jesuits as an entire order ruled the roost in terms of mathematical education. And, mathematics was the lingua franca of the Enlightenment, The Jesuits ruled the roost. Voltaire said, he hated them. He said,
exactly.
But he envied them at the same time. So you can't run into serious mathematics unless you're studying with a Jesuit, So you find a lot of those individual contributions, but in terms of the most significant correction, for me, it was Pascal's.
Interesting. And so as you say, that those are some key contributions, but how did the Catholic Church itself navigate the challenges posed by secularism during the Enlightenment? How did it sort of plot a course when that was becoming the status quo, or do you think that secularism was a status quo? I mean, I know that that's now being challenged by historians, whether the Enlightenment really was a secular project, but if it was, how did the Catholic Church navigate that challenge?
Yeah, well, let me divide your question into 2 points. I think the Enlightenment itself, it's very easy to cast it as the antithesis of religion, in particular the Catholic Church. But if you look at the goals of the Enlightenment, they're sometimes very modest, to make life a little better for everyone. Well, who could argue with that, but that's an essentially Christian idea, that you would want to form a society where everyone was comfortable or didn't suffer. I mean, who could argue with that? Well, and I think a lot of historians today understand that the values of Western civilization that congealed in the Enlightenment were the product of the values of the Catholic Church. So that's one of I think, even today in the environment we live in 2024, a lot of the things that have become sort of exaggerated about, inclusiveness. Well, that's a Christian idea. We want to include people, right? And maybe have gone a little too far. But I think the Catholic Church, again, their attention to the Enlightenment was what was going on in the Enlightenment was not a focused response, because if you take, for example, the 30 Years' War, the church lost its position in 1648 as the one institution that could have kept the unity of Europe. And from there, you see the fragmentation into nations. But from then on, the church is fighting a political battle, the French Revolution. So, when the French is worried, when the church is worried about just holding its own as a spiritual power and, a temporal power, it couldn't get very much into the realm of ideas. It was fighting these brush fires that were political and social. So, for example, you contrast that to, say, the papacy of John Paul II in the 20th century, and even Benedict. Those two popes were able to write voluminously about ideas. John Paul II covered the waterfront in terms of all of what you could think of, even, encyclicals on honoring the Sabbath, the value of work. And so back when the church was wrestling with the Enlightenment, you don't see the church issuing encyclicals like that, or documents. They're trying to just hold the fort, but because the French Revolution was, nearly totally undid the church.
And yeah, so then moving forward with that theme in terms of then reviewing the Catholic historical contribution. So your book is part of the Reclaiming Catholic History series. Can you share what you think the goals and objectives of this series are then to our historical canon?
Yeah, I think it's to place into the narrative, and it's a short book, right? It's not a very long book. The material I had to leave out was voluminous, where there could be, if it was a much more granular study of the Enlightenment, we could see in particular case studies and the case studies that I do go into. For example, Father Caussade, right?
Yeah.
And here's a good example of what I was trying to do. So if you look at the most popular main narrative of the Enlightenment, I guarantee that if you pick up the top 5 selling historical books on the Enlightenment, Father Jean de Caussade would never show up, right?
Sure.
But what I try to do is, if he shows up, if at all, as kind of a, this is a man who went off to the spiritual side of things in reaction to the fault of reason. That's not the case. I mean, when you look at his, he started out, he was a very well-educated Jesuit. He taught physics and mathematics at Lyon. And then he decided that he wanted to live a more hidden life, So the fact is, he could have stayed in that role, right? There was nothing to stop him from being among the Jesuits who were the premier mathematicians. But he decided to go another route. But when he does go this other route and becomes a great spiritual advisor, he never loses the recognition that he is preaching the gospel in a world that is vastly different, where you have this assault on faith, the preeminence of reason. And so his doctrine, for example, of the present moment, which today has become popularized as, mindfulness, right? But if you looked at him in isolation, we say, well, he's an important spiritual writer, but really nothing to do with the Enlightenment. That's not what I found. I found that he was very cognizant and could have had a career, but he wanted this spiritual journey. And if it wasn't for the Visitation Sisters, all of his writings on the spiritual life would have been lost. They copied it down very word for word. But and I do quote in my book some parts of Father Caussade's book, Abandonment to Christ, the sacrament of the present moment, where he does reference faith and reason, and what reason can and cannot do. So that's sort of an example
of what you're trying to put in and
yeah.
contribute.
Yeah,
Um,
without distorting the record, it's just
mm,
like, he would ordinarily have been a kind of side interest,
mm.
if at all.
Do you think the book contributes to debunking some myths then, a little bit like that it's kind of a secular movement or a more sort of accurate understanding of the Enlightenment then with that contribution? Because I also think that integrating Catholic religion into Enlightenment study is so critical from, well, from the time that you're doing it, looking at, yeah, Catholic political thought in the lead up to, as you say, through the 30 Years' War, how ideas of, everything from toleration and things like that started to emerge. So do you think you're, yeah, debunking some myths of how we've approached that history before with the book?
Yeah, and I think the way, I don't take a polemical view. There are some writers in church history, who are polemical about it,
Mm,
and kind of bitter at the fact that, the Catholic Church was snubbed or left out of the story. What I'd rather do is like what I said about Father Coussard is that, let's fill out the narrative, let's fill out the story, because there's more to this reality. And I think just by filling out the story, and enlarging the narrative, you can begin to see that kind of reductionist views of the Enlightenment, and also reductionist views of this reductionist big one is Enlightenment secular, church sacred, and forever at war. Not that
yeah,
that's the one, the narrative we want to refine or
exactly.
displace.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think to be able to have that supplementary material to bring in and then, yeah, and enhance our understanding is so important in terms of integrating what you're doing.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, you discuss important figures like Copernicus, Bacon, Galileo. Um, how did their sort of proto-Enlightenment, if you like, vision set the stage for the Enlightenment era in your
Yeah.
opinion?
Well, we take the figure of Galileo, and I didn't want to. Everybody has talked about the Galileo controversy and as a kind of black mark on the church. Even Pope John Paul II had to make an apology. But again, I wanted to fill out the story, and just present Galileo as a man open to the fullness of reality, right? So, he was very much, enthralled with the idea, of Copernicus, but sort of like Einstein in the 20th century. Okay, the theory sounds elegant, but we got to prove it, right? We got to have experiments. And so that Galileo would go out of his way to find, and learn about someone, in another part of Europe who was building and grinding glass to make telescopes. You know, all of that work to be able to view reality as it is,
Mm,
and that to me is worth more than, the kind of the ideological controversies.
yeah,
Is that great minds, whether they be Catholic or not, are not, they will not settle for partial views of reality or distortions of reality. And as much as I like someone like, Immanuel Kant,
mm,
uh, you know, he really, he really is not, his work is not open to the fullness of reality. He brackets things such that, uh, he was a disciple, by, not in person, but a disciple of Isaac Newton.
yeah,
This idea of the mathematization of human reason. And so, he has used that lens to distort how he sees reality. Where Galileo, he wants it head on, just like Einstein did. I'm not afraid of reality. I want this. I don't have an ideology that I want to project onto reality, but reality is something I need to absorb fully.
yeah.
That to me is a great Catholic disposition.
Vision. And yeah, you've talked about the 30 Years' War. Like, how did wars and social changes such as the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars shape religious and political practices throughout the period? Because you go through all the way to 1848 with the kind of legacies. Yeah, how would you say that that impacted it?
Yeah, that's what I always was fascinated by, a line by the great economist John Kenneth Galbraith. So
Yeah,
he
yeah.
says, he says, there is nothing like an idea whose time has come, right? And so, you have great proto-Enlightenment figures like Galileo, Bacon, and all, and they're sort of in the waiting. You could see it's like they're intellectuals, they're scholars.
Mm.
Perhaps they talk among themselves, but when an event like the 30 Years' War happens, which discredits religion, because for the common person in Europe, they would say, wait a minute, the Protestants said God was on their side, the Catholics said God was on their side, and the war ends in utter exhaustion, no decisive victory. You can say, well, is there another way that we can go to organize society? And then a lot of the and the disciples of the Enlightenment would say, here we are, we got a whole set of policies, so things like political science, economics, the interest in raising the material well-being of populations instead of focusing on the spiritual and the moral, then that's their day. I mean, it was like
Yeah,
the stage is set for them,
yeah, yeah. And yeah, coming through from there, your book highlights significant works of visual arts and music from the Enlightenment.
Mhm.
Could you share some examples and discuss their importance, particularly as a fellow music fan? And I mean, my particular music interest is in Baroque music and how that then feeds through into the sort of late 17th, early 18th century, and the political element of that, yeah, particularly in Britain, would be figures like Purcell and then into Handel's kind of time. But
Yeah.
yeah, what you think there?
Yeah, there's a section in the book where it's entitled "The Musical Enlightenment,"
Mm,
and it's an idea that especially for the German wing of the Enlightenment, the soul of Germany is music, right? When you look at the musical tradition um, that begins with uh, the Baroque, right? And
mm,
a figure like Bach takes a lot of what the Italian Baroque was doing, and he completely transforms it. And so you have this great Austro-German tradition from Bach, beginning with Luther, even Luther, Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, on and on. That this is a tradition that takes music very seriously. And so in the book, I focus on particularly Mozart's opera, uh, the I got a senior moment here, the Magic Flute.
Magic Flute, does have
Yeah,
flute.
the Magic Flute is uh, it, it's a time when the Magic Flute itself is not meant to be a court opera, right? It's
Mm,
meant to be, it's public, it's performed in a very public, popular theater, but it's chock full of sentiments of the Enlightenment.
mm,
It's very much it's the Masonic symbolism throughout, uh, and it's because the German heart, and this was another insight that Dawson had when he was talking about the Enlightenment in one of his works, is that the German soul is musical, all right, and so you have someone like Mozart who is he's one of these figures that could go either way. I mean, he obviously writes sacred music that is sublime,
mm,
but he's also very interested in uh, this Masonic. He writes that opera in German, not Italian, so that he can, so the German would understand what he's trying to do. And the Magic Flute is one of the most popular operas ever.
yeah.
So he's conveying ideas in a way to a mass audience. So the Enlightenment always had two kinds of spheres, right? especially in the 1700s. Thomas Jefferson on this side of the Atlantic, a great Enlightenment figure, Benjamin Franklin. They always spoke about that. Yes, they were even before there was an America, they saw themselves as Americans of a sort, right? They're still not independent, but their allegiance was what they would call the Republic of Letters, and this meant that they felt a kinship with all of the French philosophes, the Scottish Enlightenment. That was their true home, right? Even you can imagine if there was an internet back then. I mean, they would have been perfectly at home
Well,
with
there's
that.
some great projects I think you can see online of where the Republic of Letters have been visually mapped in a sense, where you
Yeah.
can see the beams, the links between certain philosophes all across the globe. Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating,
Yeah.
and that's sort of one realm
Hmm.
of enlightenment, right? It's the thinkers, the role of the intellectual. But then Mozart, who is not a thinker, he's a fabulous musician and composer. He takes some of the ideas there and puts them into a medium that everyone can enjoy, and so that's kind of begins the popularization of the Enlightenment. But speak about the Baroque, even before Mozart, uh, a lot of the scholarship on Bach still has this kind of, I think, outworn idea about whether, was Bach a son of the Enlightenment or a son of, the German Lutherans, more
Yeah.
religious. Was he a modern man or is he not a modern man? And I think you could see both all of that in his work as well. Uh, but the German soul, as Dawson said, is a musical soul, and if you want to convey ideas, that's the way to do it.
And in Der Zauberflot, there is almost a sort of pilgrimage to the Temple of Reason, isn't there? There's almost a whole sort of, you can almost see it literally played out before you.
Yeah,
In what ways did the Catholic Church serve as a patron of art and science during this time in their own way?
there's one story that I rehearse in the book, and it's Christina of Sweden. She's a fascinating figure. She was her father was one of the great warriors of the Protestant side during the 30 Years' War. He was killed, Gustavus Adolphus. She was, interestingly enough, she was kind of a Renaissance woman. She was a real polymath, right? Uh, but the Jesuits were called in to tutor her. Even supposedly the invitation went to Descartes to tutor Christine of Sweden. And it's not clear whether he went or not. Of course, he was not well. But anyway, the Jesuits are called in to educate Christine of Sweden. She wants to convert to Catholicism from Lutheranism, but out of respect for her her role in the dynasty, she holds off. She gives the reign over to her cousin, and she emigrates from Sweden and converts to Catholicism. So what happens? Eventually she comes to Rome. She's celebrated as this great, convert, from the Lutheranism. But because she's such a polymath, uh, she's invited to all there weren't the equivalent in Italy of the salons in France,
Yeah.
because a lot of the patrons of the more secular Enlightenment came out of the salons and the cafes in France. But in Rome, the Pope had his own kind of, I wouldn't call it a salon, but a kind of patronage where artists and intellectuals would get together. And Christina of Sweden held one of the most popular ones in Rome. So she would invite and pay. She would give money to the church for scientific projects, for the patronage of composition of music. So and the church this has been in the church as a tradition to patronize the arts. I mean, it's there almost continuously. the high point being the Italian Renaissance and the Baroque.
Mm.
But the church is still, interested in doing that. There's one other case in the book that I found. I had no idea I would discover this. But before I wrote the book, one of my figures of interest was Giambattista Vico.
Yes, yeah.
He's from Naples,
Mm.
and he was already seeing the problems with the Enlightenment. And so his legacy is the celebration of history and the humanities.
Mm.
But what I found out was he was a near contemporary of St. Alphonsus Liguori, who was the founder of the Redemptorist Fathers. And they were both lawyers. They both studied at University of Naples, where Thomas Aquinas studied. And they were so famous, each of them in their own right, that they had to have known each other. I couldn't find any direct
link, yeah,
but it's just, and so it's very interesting that out of that, University of Naples was founded as the first non-religious university in Italy. And out of that, you get Thomas Aquinas, St. Alphonsus Liguori, and Giambattista Vico. But the idea of someone like St. Alphonsus Liguori, who is going to be writing his own work. He was a lawyer, just like Vico was a lawyer. But then, Alfonso Liguori turns to writing these great religious the treatises, on morality, on the Trinity, on the Blessed Mother, and all that. Vico goes in a slightly different direction. He still remains a Catholic, but he's this sort of a force in the counter-enlightenment.
With his was it Nouveau Scienza, New Science?
Yes,
yeah. No, that's fascinating, and in that proximity, surely they must have encountered. But well, the book touches on how Catholic thinkers influenced the separation of church and state. Can you provide examples of this influence?
Yeah, I think the church has always been from the beginning, the idea of Pope Gelasius in the early church about the doctrine of the two swords. There's the secular and the religious. And I think the church began to sharpen, the Catholic Church began to sharpen that understanding that there's the secular and the sacred power. The secular power is subordinate to the spiritual, but they are indeed separate. I think this especially was the case and this is a little before the Enlightenment with John Calvin and what he was doing in Geneva, trying to create basically a theocracy. The church did not want to get involved in that kind of theocratic instance, but throughout the Enlightenment, you would see that, and the French Revolution, I think, is the high point of that, when the church is actually, actually dismissed from France and then has to come back in the 19th century. But the church always held fast throughout this period of keeping the secular and the church and the state separate. Now, sometimes it could become radicalized. Thomas Jefferson is a premier example. The whole tradition of, as in the United States, called the Wall of Separation, is based on a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. It's not even a formal political document. But the church throughout the Enlightenment is insisting on that this is an important distinction. Neither the secular nor the sacred or the church should be all powerful in the government of society. And I think the case of the French Revolution really sharpened that.
And funnily enough, as I said, I was working on sort of re-examining Bellarmine's work on political thought, and with him sitting just before in the conclusion of my dissertation, I may have been a bit overdramatic, but I almost said in some ways he was more enlightened than some of his sort of enlightened followers and thinkers later, because he saw that you needed a check and balance, a balance of powers between, as you say, the two swords. You need something to mitigate despotism and tyranny within the secular. And as you say, the French Revolution demonstrates that in terms of having a fine balance between the secular and the spiritual. Yes, how did Enlightenment ideals manifest in figures like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson in the American colonies?
Yeah, I think well, in the book, I point out how Benjamin Franklin was the darling of the French Enlightenment. You know, he was invited to all the salons, and I would recommend, if people haven't seen this, this is not a part of my book, but there was a series called John Adams. I think it was an HBO series. But the figure of, they got Franklin right. You know, he was a very clever man. You know, the Enlightenment comes through him full force, you know, in his autobiography when he's talking about the virtues. Those virtues that he speaks about, they could have easily been written by any Christian, but he sort of extracts them out and puts them on their own, very much like what the French did in the Reign of Terror. You know, that the idea of virtue extracted from a religious foundation. But Franklin was, when he traveled all over Europe and England. He actually paid for Thomas Paine, the writer of the pamphlet Common Sense, which was one of the most important provocations towards American revolt from Britain. And Franklin paid for his passage, Paine's passage from Britain to America. Of course, Thomas Paine was getting himself into nothing but trouble. And I quote a statistic in the book that on a per capita basis, the pamphlet Common Sense is still had been the most widely read document in American history. You know,
Oh wow,
a text at all. Yeah. It was one of those moments, because it still kind of had a lot of, like, talks about virtue and freedom and all these good things that come out of the Christian tradition. And for that resonated with the Puritan Protestant elite in America. But eventually, you know, it became very clear that Paine, after the revolution of 1776, that Paine was not at all interested in the same things that the Puritans and other Protestants and other Christians were interested in. But Jefferson was, you know, I said the Enlightenment is this kind of empire of division, but Jefferson was different than that. He was a real polymath. He was unique in this way. You know, he founded the University of Virginia. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He played the violin. He was fluent in French, a great diplomat, great diplomatic skills. In fact, there's a little vignette, I didn't put it in the book, but it's one of these great stories where when John F. Kennedy was president, and he had assembled one of the, he called it the best and the brightest, you know, the best thinkers that they were available at Harvard and MIT and elsewhere. They come and become part of his cabinet. And his first dinner with all these people, he says, gentlemen, he says, this is the most august assembly of minds in American history, besides the time when Thomas Jefferson dined with himself. You know, you know, that was Jefferson's, you know, he was a real polymath. But that, you know, for the Enlightenment thinkers, that was a little bit unusual. But, you know, and it's sad today, and especially American history, because the connection between Jefferson and slavery, this is one of the things that, you know, some people just, especially students, told just dismiss him. But, you know, you would miss out on the richness of what he thought and what he did. Very complicated figure, you know. But it was the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document. There is no question about it. No question. You know, there've been attempts to try to reground it in Christian principles, and you could do that, endowed by their creator. Yeah, there's a God. But the idea of God for Jefferson is not the same idea of God as you would find in the Puritans or the Anglicans or the Catholics.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I mean, that direct link, as you say, back to Enlightenment virtues. And I think I'm looking at ideas in England during the 18th century, and something I come across a lot in a lot of Enlightenment texts is that the Enlightenment skipped over England almost. Yes, you had Thomas Paine, but it almost skipped over from Paris to America via England, but not really picking anything up on the way other than a couple of odds and sods sort of things. I mean, I don't know if you'd say that there was any particular Englishness to an American Enlightenment, but I mean, it's difficult to trace what an English Enlightenment is.
There's a book by Gary Wills that was published a few decades ago. It's a fascinating book. It's kind of it runs counter to the typical view of the American founding, where he ties the entire American founding to the Scottish Enlightenment. And I think there's a lot to be said there. The book is Gary Wills is a really fine, he's a classicist by training. But the typical narrative in America is that, the founding of America was heavily reliant on John Locke, the compact. So there's a direct, relationship. But there are others. There's Henry May's great book on the American Enlightenment. Really gives a rich discussion about how Americans absorbed the thinking of European Enlightenment philosophers, both French and English. Not so much the Germans. The German influence came a little later in the 19th century with someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yes, and the Transcendentalists.
But the founding generation, it was I shouldn't say. I mean, the founding generation also was fascinated with Rome.
And there's that republic. I know some of my professors in St Andrews, when I was up there, were very interested in that kind of republican direction from Rome to
that great book by Pocock, The Machiavellian Moment. But you could see that it's a republican ideal ripped out of the context of it's pre-Christian republicanism, and that's squared very well with Enlightenment thinking about the virtues needed for a republican government, but those virtues need not be grounded in anything religious, and they say it's just like the Roman virtues. They were grounded in a sort of in the idea of piety, but it wasn't in any sense a Christian piety. It was just a respect for the transcendent. But when the French Revolution is talking about virtue, and the Jacobins pick that up, they really have they can back it up with the Roman Republic, which was pre-Christian.
No, I don't know how much time you have, Dominic, but I mean, if we could just quickly go over kind of like what your views of Enlightenment legacies are, because I'm quite interested in how we see, you were talking about sort of like silos and disciplinization earlier in terms of what the Enlightenment did. But what do you think are some positive and negative in terms of the way you read Enlightenment, sort of remnants that we see today?
Yeah, I think on balance, the Enlightenment, the kind of pivot towards technology and science, there's no question that it has, enriched the lives of many, not just in American Europe, but all over the world now. But in this, as I say at the very end of the book, is that, and again, the seeds of this are in 1648 is since the higher questions that humans are interested in, the transcendent questions, and they need not even be religious, it's just like, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? The big questions are kind of that the technology and the fascination that with technology that comes out of the Enlightenment distracts people from those questions, right? So you can live the life of a brute, you're going to be a well-fed animal, right? But there's something else about humans that the Enlightenment has tended to suppress.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the Enlightenment is under attack from both the left and the right today.
Yes, yeah.
The postmodern complaint about the Enlightenment is there's a whole list. But and then in America, the figure of Alistair McIntyre has really called into question what he calls the Enlightenment project and its deficits. So what's amazing to me is that a whole movement under the assault from both left and right still has a kind of appeal to people. Again, I think it's because of what it can do for us in terms of material. Well, but the fact that same technology gave us devastating world wars, the atomic bomb, all of that. It doesn't matter to people. I think are still drawn by the material benefits that you get from it.
And I suppose, as you say, because of that progress, we can critique the progress obsession that the Enlightenment brought. But there's a book like What's Left of Enlightenment, and the authors, I think one of the things they say is that it's actually the talking, the discourse, which is the great thing that I think endears people to Enlightenment still. Just the fact that you can have a civilized conversation with someone about the world or politics or philosophy, that is one thing that we need to cherish in our modern day when, as you say, the left and the right are attacking it. And if they go into their silos, then one thing the Enlightenment holds is, just the ability to talk and discuss and what we're doing now.
No, that's it. The pleasure, a friend of mine at Stanford always says, talks about the narcotic of good conversation, that he's got a wonderful podcast out in Stanford. And the pleasure of conversation, and the Enlightenment always wanted to take that conversation and find how do we realize its fruits into the benefit of society.
That's dear. I mean, my last thing would be, do you have any personal insights, perhaps whether there were any discoveries or any challenges, or perhaps as a historian, how do you balance the portrayal of historical events and figures to provide a nuanced perspective? So I suppose just, your kind of almost methodology as a historian would be the last thing.
Yeah, I think my the discovery I made with this is where you and I were both at university, we got trained in history, and so things, right? The story, but then you discover something like, to me, the degree to which the 30 Years' War was so important to the Enlightenment spread. And then, so I then say, oh yeah, let's think about the Great War of World War One, World War Two. And so I began to think about, when the time we live in right now, we're still, 70 or more years in the shadow of World War Two. How many of the things we're still experience are the result of that war? And so when I think about the aftermath of the 30th War and what it produced, now I'm thinking about the aftermath of World War II in America and in Europe, and how is that affecting what we are worried about right now? So that's kind of an insight that I transferred from one period to another. I think for many people, you can say, well, the devastation of war, it's obvious. But when you get into the details of it, you get a kind of profound understanding. Yes, that's true. It's not trivial. It's not cliche.
Yeah.
there's something substantive about it that I didn't experience before.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dominic. I really appreciate it
It's
for all
been
the
great,
time
Sam.
you put
And I wish you the best in all your work and completing your dissertation.
Thank
And
you.
if you find yourself on this side of the Atlantic, you got to come visit me.
Oh, I would love to. Most certainly, we'll arrange it. Before we wrap up, I'd like to personally encourage you, our listeners, to go out and explore Dr. Dominic Aquila's book, The Church in the Age of Enlightenment, 1648 to 1848. It's a captivating journey through a pivotal period in history, offering valuable insights into the intricate relationship between the Church and the Enlightenment. If our conversation today has piqued your interest, this book is an excellent opportunity to delve deeper into Dr. Aquila's perspectives on this transformative era. So go ahead and grab a copy. Happy reading. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering the intricate intellectual threads that lie beyond the text.